We're live.
Great. Good afternoon. Welcome back to Senate Education. It's 2:29 on January 10th. So pleased to see Mr. Francis and Ms. Myers. Thanks for joining us. Jeff and I have a long history together on education policy, and Ms. Myers, you and I also have developed a good history over the past couple of years. So thanks for being with us. Very much appreciate it.
Very happy to be here with you in person.
Yeah, in person, absolutely. So if you don't mind, what we've asked people to do today is just talk, introduce yourselves a little bit about the association, the work you've done. You both have very interesting and important backgrounds, so it'll be good for us all to hear, as well a little bit about your priorities for this year, a little bit of also the landscape as you see it.
Right.
In particular, I think, and this was mentioned a little bit earlier today at the Democratic caucus, I don't know if it came up in the Republican caucus, but we are interested in knowing certainly what can we do right now as it relates to COVID recovery, and are there things that need to be done? Are there things that don't need to be done? So with a sort of an eye on that would be great as well. So with that,
thank you very much. You introduced us. I'm Jeff Francis. I'm the Executive Director for the Vermont Superintendents Association. This is my colleague.
I'm Chelsea Myers. I'm the Associate Executive Director of the Vermont Superintendents Association.
Senator Campion mentioned that he and I have done a lot of work together over the years. I'm not sure when it started, our work together.
we're in 2010.
Right. So I will speak very briefly about my background, but before I do, I wanted to let you know that we brought you education directories, which is really a lot of information about schools in Vermont. You can flip through that at your leisure, but usually, in other years, I've been invited to this committee for the sole purpose of bringing these directories. So I thought I would bring one over with me today.
Thank you.
We also have some prepared remarks that I've sent to Hayden, and we're going to speak to those remarks. It's an outline that's consistent, Senator Campion, with the comments that you made in terms of our introduction.
And
I also
do we have paper copies of those, or are they?
No, not those. Would you like me to share them?
It's up to the committee.
Yeah, why don't you share them back if that's what everybody, yeah.
I also wanted to let you know, and I've heard you make reference to your schedule next week. On Thursday next week, our association is having a full day meeting at Capitol Plaza on the 19th, which is Thursday.
Okay.
And if it's possible for you to pay us a visit, we would love that. We'll invite you for lunch. So I know that this is the prerogative of the chair, but I'll talk to Senator Campion about the prospects for you coming over to visit us at Capitol Plaza. And if you can't, we certainly will understand, but it would give you an opportunity to interact with the state's 55 superintendents. So
Thank you for that.
In terms of my background, I have been with the Superintendents Association since the late 1990s. My immediate predecessor was Richard Cate, who's now the vice president for finance and administration at UVM. My background is not in education, although I come from a family of educators. I started my career as a town manager. I worked as the town manager in Bellows Falls and Rockingham. And prior to that, I was the town administrator in Hinsdale, New Hampshire, which is your neck of the woods. In the late 1980s, I was seeking a career change, and I knew a gentleman who's legendary in Vermont politics and public policy, Al Moulton, who was had been Dean Davis's chief of staff, worked in the Snelling administration as the commissioner of economic development, and was hired by Madeline Kunin as the secretary of the Agency of Commerce and Community Affairs. I was hired by him to be his deputy. And I worked in the Kunin administration in that capacity for a number of years. And then when there was a transition to Governor Snelling's administration, I went to work at the Vermont Housing Finance Agency and came back to Montpelier as the executive director of the Superintendents Association, not because I had a lot of knowledge on education, but because I had a lot of knowledge about the workings of state government. And I will say with all sincerity that it has been a fantastic job for me. I think that there's no more interesting public policy generally than education. I think it's very virtuous and altruistic work in terms of what we do for the kids, but certainly for communities and for society. And because of my love for public policy and people, I've really enjoyed my work with the association. I try to do my very best to give information, share ideas, and support the work that all of our partners do. And if I can take the liberty of saying that we consider the General Assembly a partner in public education, that's really the attitude that I have. Chelsea, why don't you talk a little bit about, and I love working with Chelsea.
I don't have as many fun Vermont stories as Jeff, but I'm working on it.
Good.
I'm from Vermont. I grew up in Colchester and went away for a couple of years and then couldn't resist and came back. I began my career in educational neuroscience research at the University of California, San Francisco, doing primarily early literacy acquisition research and social and emotional learning acquisition research as well. And then I was a science teacher for a couple of years. My bachelor's is in biology. And then I went to graduate school for education policy and management at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And then, like I said, couldn't resist, came back to Vermont and have been working with Jeff and the wonderful superintendents of the state for almost 5 years now.
Really?
So, yeah, spent some time. Time flies.
Right, and I might add, at the time we hired Chelsea, we wanted to make greater contributions on the education side.
Yeah.
The operating premise when I was hired was that superintendents knew a lot about education and they wanted help navigating the public policy arena in this building and otherwise. But the more complicated and complex things became in education, and the more as a society we turned into doing more for students, it became, I think, important that we have somebody in the organization that could hold their own in every aspect of the education delivery system. So I think we make a good team. I'm not sure how much longer I'll be around, and I think Chelsea has the association in good stead if she chooses to continue her work with the association here in Vermont. So,
Well, you both have been great to work with over, the past couple of years. Jeff, I'll say, you're such a straight shooter. You and I may not always 100% agree, but I really appreciate your partnership and glad you're back. Glad you're not
appreciate
gone.
that
Yeah,
and
yeah,
feel
yeah.
the same way about your service in government. So what I'll do very, very briefly is give you an overview of the association itself. And then Chelsea's going to speak to our current work. And then because I knew the assignment, had a meeting with the VSA Board of Trustees and Chelsea last Friday, at which time I asked them from their vantage point about perspective on how things are going currently.
Great.
So there were two prompts that we provided. One was, what's your current perspective? And secondly, what can the General Assembly do to help? We got further on the first question, but we'll be prepared to both respond to and work with you on the second question, so we have some ideas about that too. So the association, as the name indicates, is the Association of Superintendents in Vermont. There are 55 superintendents in Vermont. That's fewer than there were when I started. At the time I started, there were 63. We, through processes of consolidation and Act 46, reduced the number of superintendents serving school systems in Vermont. Now at 55, it's actually crept back up because of the addition of a new career and technical education district in central Vermont. So of the 55 superintendents, they serve about 117 school districts. Many are organized in single school districts. Some still are in the supervisory union format. And there are 4 career and technical education center districts. One in Bennington, one in Springfield, one in Middlebury, and now one in Barry, each serving their own region. The organization's mission is to ensure that public education supports each and every student in acquiring knowledge, skills, and dispositions needed for success in a rapidly changing world. And in order to do that, we focus on four main areas. One, we seek to promote improvements to laws, regulations, and practices. That speaks to our engagement in the public policy arena. We engage partners to support a framework for transforming public education to meet the needs of 21st century learners. So we have associations not only with the General Assembly, but also with the other education organizations, business organizations, community organizations. So we try to interact constructively with as many partners as we can. We do a lot of analysis for superintendents with regard to what's transpiring in public education. So even though we have a modest staff of 3 people, we really try to engage in making sure that we are interpreting accurately what's going on, not only with laws and regulations that have been enacted, but also things that you might contemplate here in this building. And finally, we do a lot of work with professional development for superintendents and also direct support to superintendents. So Chelsea will elaborate about our professional learning work. Both of us have probably daily conversations with one or more superintendents about something specific that's happening in their district, always with an eye toward helping them get answers, helping them contend with a particular problem. And in my case, it's largely through my experience and what I've accumulated in terms of my own professional awareness over the years. Similarly for Chelsea, but she also, as she noted, has got a very strong education background. So that's the core of our work. We are governed by a 10-member board of trustees. We're a 501c6 nonprofit, which is organized along the lines of a chamber of commerce or business league. Those were the origins when the organization was founded. But in addition to the support for the members themselves, we really do try to bring our best work to everything that schools are doing. And that will be in evidence when Chelsea talks about the work that we're doing in those arenas. We have that 10-member board of trustees. And when you see the written testimony, I've listed all the trustees. There are,
We have it up behind.
Okay, great.
So, yeah.
4 officers, a past president, and a superintendent from each of 5 regions that are organized based on the geographic proximities of the state. As I mentioned, 3 staff, myself, Chelsea, and our office manager, Christy Tate. The 5 regional superintendent groups that I mentioned historically have gotten together on a monthly basis. Through the pandemic, sometimes they were meeting daily. So Senator Campion mentioned the strong work by the agency in leading the state's COVID response. I agree with that entirely. That work was supported by folks in the field, and folks in the field were supported by the agency. So superintendents operate in a tight network in order to support one another in their professional endeavors. As I mentioned, and I'll wrap up and then we'll shift to Chelsea. 3 specific areas of our work currently: support for our members, engage in the education policy arena, and then provide professional learning opportunities and also support for individual superintendents.
As Jeff mentioned, I do a lot of the work around our professional learning for superintendents, central office administrators. I also work with communications directors. Recently, we have begun working a lot more extensively with facilities managers and their staff, and thinking about facilities and improving facilities and how we move forward both legislatively and in our advocacy efforts, as well as from a professional learning standpoint, and like putting some more professionalism and uniformity around the position across the field. I also do a lot of our equity and inclusion work and sit on a number of councils that you all have made through laws over the past several years as well. So I will mention a few of the areas of focus, and I jotted down some notes based on the conversation you had with Secretary French too, which might have a little bit more information about some of the topics of interest that you were focused on in the last hour. So most recently, we've been supporting superintendents and school districts in state initiatives such as Act 173. That was a major education law that shifted the education funding system from special ed funding system from a reimbursement model to a block grant. And that has now gone into effect. And the underlying education principles that came along with that is something that we've really focused on from an implementation standpoint at our association supporting superintendents. So what is the best general education or general tier one, which you'll hear a lot about in the multi-tiered systems of support. So what does that core instruction in the classroom look like from an inclusivity standpoint? We've really done a lot with that and brought in some national experts to support us in that work. PCB sampling, Jeff does a lot of the facilities work around the PCB effort. I don't know if you want to.
No, there'll probably
right
be
now.
time to talk about that later this
Yeah.
session too. Yeah.
Got it on our list, yeah.
Preparation for the field for implementation of the proposed changes to the education quality standards under Act 1. So that was the ethnic and social equity standards work of 2018, I believe. And so the rules for the education quality standards, which are now sitting at the State Board of Education, the suggested changes are now sitting at the State Board of Education for review to make our education quality standards more inclusive and representative of all our entire population within the state. So I've been doing several presentations and workshops around the state, introducing administrators to that work. We are monitoring the development of school district quality standards under Act 127. I won't elaborate a ton on that because I think Secretary French covered that. Emphasizing equity and inclusion through programs of the association and partnerships with other organizations. So we were fortunate enough to get a grant from the Vermont Community Foundation in collaboration with the School Boards Association and the Principals Association. We've been doing some joint work around equity inclusion, particularly as it pertains to boards and strengthening their understanding of like, how do you look for, are you running an equitable school district, and have been fortunate enough to distribute what we call mini grants to a number of schools across the state and seen some really great projects from teachers and students and school boards, and be happy to share those at some point as kind of some bright spots around the state at a later date. And then we focus more generally on best practices in school leadership and leadership development, and always have a cohort of the incoming superintendents. So the first year superintendents get a lot of support from us, and we run an aspiring superintendent leadership academy too. So anyone that's interested in the superintendency goes through that.
Can I just ask a quick question as it relates to how many new superintendents started this year? I know the principal.
20 transitions, 11 new ones, new superintendents.
When you say transition, sort of associate to
Or one school district to another.
I see. Okay, thank you.
I chuckled when I said the word a lot because my kids who are now 30 and 32, I'll say, you know, the car you're looking at, how much does it cost? And they'll say a lot. They know, you know, so I'm always looking to quantify things. 20 was a record in terms of transitions in my memory. And I think there'll be fewer this year, but there is some lack of stability associated with current conditions that I think tied to the pandemic in certain ways.
Thank you.
And then I just wanted to speak, you mentioned teacher evaluation. Over the last 4 years, we've been working with the University of Washington primarily with superintendents, central office leaders, and principals on thinking about cycles, like improvement cycles. So we'll go into school districts with other school districts and do classroom visits and think about the ways in which we have a continuous kind of improvement cycle with teacher observation. And then that program has also linked into, well, let's look at our teacher evaluation system and make sure we're embedding not just the evaluation, but that constant support and feedback loop So we've been really helping support districts to build out that system. So I have not personally worked with a system that does not have an evaluation process through that. And I think we've probably had the majority of districts at this point gone through at least one of those programs that we've been doing with the University of Washington. I think that's it from me, unless I spoke too fast and you have questions or used acronyms.
Okay, thanks. So what I wanted to do on the topic of how things are going is just report to you thematically what we heard from superintendents. And again, we had a trustees meeting on Friday. I knew Chelsea and I would come here on Tuesday. So we started our 3-hour meeting with an exercise that provided them with the prompt, how are things going with public education? They wrote independently around that question. And then I took that information and put it into themes. And, you know, it may be that you find the themes discouraging. I don't. I think it's a realization of where we are. Senator Campion said that, you know, my effort is always to sort of speak very candidly. And in this case, that's what I've done. I think that the solutions that we're going to have an opportunity to craft, and I'm very appreciative of the fact that that's the interest on the part of this committee. We can bring folks who have a lot of awareness about what's transpiring in the field so that you can consider that along with other input and maybe make some policy decisions. So the first theme that emerged was that educators generally are unflappable in their commitment to children and their learning and growth processes. Teachers and all educators are working tirelessly. And for those of you who exist in this policy space, and you all do now, you'll see conflicts sometimes between teachers and administrators, for example, because it's the public education delivery system is very dynamic and there's sometimes disagreement. But I think that currently and through the pandemic, we saw an emergence of esprit de corps, as it were, of everybody working together in an effort to make sure that we came through as well as we can. It was really I think a high point in terms of the response from the education community. You've also heard about worker shortages, and worker shortages are in fact problematic. The agency has its own work that it's doing in that area right now. We think that the General Assembly will turn into it as well. When the superintendents wrote about worker shortages, they did note the variety of effects across some systems, but they also noted, and I found this interesting, is that in communities themselves, people who are from among the citizenry have risen to the occasion and gone to work in schools. And that wasn't something that I had thought of and don't have data on it, but I thought it was worthwhile mentioning because it is reflective of sort of the intentionality that's brought in support of our public education system. Despite the commitment on the part of our educators, the tremendous demands on them and the system overall are contributing to employee and system fatigue. So there are serious residual effects from what we've come through. Technology is being increasingly relied on and has been effective in supporting the learning process. So I think that would occur to people, and they spoke to that in their writing to that prompt.
Just saying a little bit more about in what way is technology sort of popping up?
I think it starts with the expansion of online learning, which, you know, you would not construe as theoretical prior to the pandemic, but we got a lot of experience in terms of how to utilize technology, not only in processes like you have here today, but also in the learning process.
Yeah.
Anything you want to add to that, Chelsea, in terms of like the academic elements of it per se?
No.
Okay. Persistent pressures brought about by the enactment and implementation of new or expanded initiatives by the General Assembly and the agency add to the stress being experienced in the field. And that's, I think, an objective analysis. If you asked me, given my tenure with the Superintendent's Association, what was the most dynamic period for new education policy and initiatives, I would pick the era between 2015 and 2020. When you consider Act 46, 173, Act 127, combined with the implications of the pandemic, it's been quite stressful. Last year, the education organizations came to the Senate Education Committee and responded to a question similar to what we're responding to today. And they said, don't pass any new legislation, right? I can't speak for the other education associations. That's not our position this year. Our position this year, which I'll talk about at the end of our presentation, is really to make the legislation, and this isn't to say it hasn't been in the past, but as purposeful as we can, given the circumstances that we're aware of. So the context that we're building around, the response to a very simple question, which is more complicated than the responses, I think is going to help inform what it is you are going to want to do, or I hope that you're going to want to do through your own processes here in this committee. The stakes and pressures in the field are greater than they are in other entities within the public education ecosystem. So Secretary French talked about support. He talked about leadership. He talked about monitoring. The General Assembly convenes every year for 5 months, and they work to do things to improve life in Vermont overall. When you think about the cumulative effect of new initiatives or regulations in public education, they all land one place, at the school. So in an era where there's a lot of pressure that's been brought to bear as a result of the pandemic, for example, the challenges associated with anything new that you do, any new challenge, it's exacerbated. So the context really is what's been the cumulative effect. How are we doing with the legislation policy that's been enacted over the last several years? Chelsea mentioned 173. 173 passed in 2018. We spent a day or an afternoon, complete afternoon with 150 legislators in December working on 173 implementation.
Not legislators, education administrators.
Right, did I say legislators? Sorry about that. Business managers, special ed directors, and superintendents trying to help them with that implementation.
Senator Bowie.
Is it okay?
Sure, by all means.
Okay, would you like to finish your list?
No, I mean, we said we'd be finished by 3.
We're gonna go a couple minutes.
We can go a little longer.
Yeah, we can go till about 3:10.
Okay, so, sure.
I've had a couple of thoughts as we've been going through this. The one that you just talked about in terms of the workload or the demands on superintendents. As someone who's been watching things unfold the last few years, it almost seems to me at times that the job of superintendent is not sustainable and it's almost like too big. And then when you throw on unexpected, pandemics, or in our case, it was not only a pandemic, but the closure of a high school. It's really, it's been hard to witness, and I'm concerned. I'm
Right.
really concerned. So I hear that loud and clear, this bit. And I think we need to pay attention to it. It's
Right.
really important.
I appreciate that observation, and I would make that observation. It's remarkable to me how few superintendents make that observation themselves. I mean, almost from, across the board in public education, you have people who are willingly going into work every day, and they're doing the work irrespective of the challenges that are brought to bear. So I'm 100% honest when I say this. Rarely, if ever, do I hear superintendents complain about the conditions that are affecting them. These observations were really what they observed in the system, but I appreciate your sentiment, and I think it's true. The next one that they talked about was one that has had attention in the General Assembly, and we're happy about that. That's the condition of facilities. So as you'll learn through your work on the committee, and as some of you already know, Vermont, in effect, stopped making a state investment in school facilities in 2007. Most of the facilities in Vermont were built in the era that stemmed through the 50s into the early 60s. There are many schools, despite efforts at maintaining them properly, and I'd add parenthetically, there are plenty of instances of deferred maintenance as well. they're threadbare. And when you consider our facilities to other facilities in states in New England, like Massachusetts and Rhode Island, New Hampshire and Maine, we really don't compare favorably. And when you think about the competitiveness of Vermont economically and as a destination for new workers, and we always, when we talk about new workers, you hear the term young families plays into that. It's a challenge in this state to create an image to people who might consider coming here that we've got schools that are modern and really as good as you could have. And I don't want to overstate that, but we're appreciative of the fact that the General Assembly, starting with Act 72, is trying to set up a network where we can correct that. And that is a focus that needs to be maintained, I think, in order to continue Vermont's position in the region favorably for public education. So they talk about that, and what the superintendent spoke of is that if the facilities aren't up to snuff, then when you have other challenges, like the challenges we saw through the pandemic, then it becomes that much more obvious.
Senator Williams.
Yeah.
If I could, sorry, before you jump to the next
Sure,
topic,
sure.
how do you quantify that? Like, if our constituents want to know, the status of our schools compared to Massachusetts, et cetera,
Right.
how do we quantify
It's
that?
being quantified right now under Act 72.
Okay.
So Act 72 had two provisions. One was an inventory, one was an assessment. And it was a methodical study of the sort of a drive-by condition of the schools that was informed by a self-assessment of the school facility staff. And now there is it's a world recognized firm that is coming in and doing a much more methodical study of our schools, which will result in a conditions analysis that you'll be able to see.
Okay,
The results of the preliminary analysis are on the AOE website right now.
I'll take a look at it.
Yeah.
It does fold in that condition of the other, other states.
Now, what the reason that I made that comment on the other states is when we were working on Act 72, we looked at the processes in Rhode Island and Massachusetts in particular, which has an entity called the Mass School Financing Authority. And they just have, a wide array of data on the conditions of schools there and how they place investment in those schools. So that I think will become, that's the answer, really.
Thank you.
I apologize, Jeff. We do have Ledge Council. It has
Yeah.
to start at 3:10. So
Okay,
maybe
I'll pick it up.
overview.
So just a couple things. Mental health challenges. So there's that third bullet from the bottom. Yeah, I mean, these things you can all read for yourself. There is, when superintendents get together, one of the things that they always talk about are the challenges associated with the need around student behavior and mental health challenges, how through the pandemic, the services provided by the mental health agencies have been affected adversely, that schools are increasingly picking up the services that are required in those arenas. And it's an area that really, and I know it's a subject of legislative interest that really needs to be tended to. What we're hearing anecdotally is that schools are hiring staff and actually performing mental health services that in the past would have been handled by the designated agencies. So you've got transfer of employees going on, et cetera, et cetera. The second to the last bullet has to do with mounting fiscal pressures. As you probably saw in the media or in briefings for this committee, education spending is slated to go up around 8% this year. Historically, that's a higher number than I ever recall. It's attributable to a lot of factors, some of which are indicated in that bullet. And that is something that we all need to pay attention to, because the whole question of sustainability is a very good question. You'll weigh in on utilization of money, utilization of fund reserves, what schools are spending money on, and, you know, we can talk with you more about that at another time, but that is weighing on the minds of school superintendents and administrators generally. And then it was noted in that exercise that we did that as significant as these challenges are, they play out differently in different regions of the state, and some of the more challenging implications are happening in the more rural areas. So that was their perspective with regard to how things are going. I think, you know, one would argue that it's somewhat stated in the negative. There's a lot of good things happening in schools, but I think it's a realistic depiction of the challenges that we face. In terms of what the legislature can do, I won't continue to refer to the testimony. I'll just say, work with us. We as an association and superintendents as individuals are eager to be constructive partners in what it is we're trying to achieve collectively from a public education standpoint. We each have roles to play. And I think if we can continue to work well together, you do your job to enact legislation to benefit the state of Vermont and respond to the priorities that you see. And we'll come in with an honest assessment from these school leaders, convey it to you in terms that you can understand and question and ask for more information on. And if that process leads to a better product, a better outcome legislatively, that's the role we want to play. So thanks.
Jeff, 8%, I mean, am I naive to have thought that given the incredible investment we made, you know, with the federal dollars,
Right.
that, you know, we might not see that kind of jump?
Right.
Because, you know, every time I'm talking to somebody, they're saying, hey, we took those dollars, we put them right into our school. We've got now, have been able to cover these kinds of costs that we couldn't have otherwise.
Right.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the money was used for immediate COVID response,
Yeah.
improvement of facilities, which need to improve more, supporting the staff that were working so hard through the pandemic, who need to be continued to be supported.
Yeah.
Just natural inflationary costs. I mean, all of this hit at a time when there's like dramatic effects everywhere you turn. So I think that it's a challenge that we're gonna have to confront collectively. The tone of the December 1st letter this year out of the tax department, I noted was different than it had been in the last several years, because it was not about cost containment. It was a recognition of pressures, but sustainability and cost containment are not gonna go away in the public policy sphere. And they have not gone away for the Superintendent's Association in all the years I've been working. They're not going to go away this year, but we have to contend with the challenges that we face. And I think while this isn't a particularly artful depiction, I think that there is truth, at least on the part of superintendents and by extension our association, as to what we see right now, and it's challenging.
May I just add that I think if we looked at what budgets were paying for 10 years ago, 5 years ago, and what they're paying for now, and I just would love for like our local school districts to share like the amount of mental health services they're taking on. Some have health clinics, dental clinics, are
They've
supporting
taken these
adult
dollars
education.
Used.
In some cases,
Yeah.
yes, but want to build them in a sustainable model for
Right.
the future, and have added positions that they want to put into the regular budget as well.
Senator Williams.
And you can't budget for inflation.
Right.
Nobody saw that coming.
Yeah.
So, I mean, here we are, and we're at your service. So
Really
thank you.
appreciate that. Yeah, great to have both of you here. Any final questions for either Chelsea or Jeff?
I just think that list was fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Very helpful.
Appreciate it very much. Thank
To
you.
see you soon.
Looking forward to continuing our work together.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. We're just waiting for Beth to come in, so if anybody wants to take a quick stretch, we'll probably be here in about 2 minutes. And then we'll